Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Charities Lean Forward, Strengthening Your Charities Against Money Laundering and Terrorist Financing, the Next Steps. This webinar is organized by Pro Bono SG in collaboration with the Office of the Commissioner of Charities. My name is Regana, and I will be your moderator for today. Before we begin, here are some housekeeping matters to take note of. Q&A. Today we will be using Pigeonhole Live for our Q&A session. You may submit your questions at any point during the webinar and vote for the questions by others that you would like to be answered. I'll do my best to address all your questions together with our panel later. Now, if you have a smartphone or a tablet with you, just launch your internet browser and enter www.pigeonhole.at into the address bar. Then key in our event passcode, which is CLF2501, as shown on the slide right now. Alternatively, you can click on the link that is shared in the chat function to launch Pigeonhole Live on your device. If you're viewing this webinar on your desktop or laptop, you should receive an invitation to launch Pigeonhole. Finally, please note that today's discussion is not intended to substitute any form of professional legal advice. If you require specific legal advice, please consult a lawyer. Links will be shared in the process of the session. To be sure, please keep an eye out in the chat function. A copy of today's slides and links will be included in the follow-up email sent tomorrow. So let's start this webinar proper. Today's webinar focuses on the future of the charity sector and the critical next steps needed to strengthen its resilience. Together with our speakers and panelists, we will explore what is next and actionable insights to guide you forward. We are kicking things off with an opening address by the Commissioner of Charities, Mr. Desmond Chin, followed by a sharing session by Ms. Yap Ling Xuan from the Ministry of Home Affairs and Mr. Lim Jun Yang from the Suspicious Transaction Reporting Office, Singapore Police Force. And to round off the webinar, we have our panel of experts. Together with me, we will walk you through some case scenarios and answer and try to get to all of your questions during the Q&A. And it gives me immense pleasure to extend a warm welcome to our Commissioner of Charities, Mr. Desmond Chin, to give the opening address. Hi, Mr. Chin.
Hi, Regana. Thanks for hosting again. It's always delightful to have you here.
Yeah. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be able to welcome you to our webinar, Strengthening Charities Against Money Laundering and Terrorist Financing, the Next Steps. The last run of the webinar was conducted in November 2023. I believe it was just after the 3 billion money laundering case. There were over 1,000 persons, individuals who attended, and I'm glad to see that there are also over 1,000 people who are attending today. Now, since then, my office has rolled out resources to support charities in conducting due diligence checks and in adopting measures to safeguard themselves from being exploited for illicit purposes such as money laundering and terrorist financing. We are going to delve deeper into how charities can tap on existing resources to safeguard your charities against the abuse for money laundering and terrorist financing in this webinar. Now, charities, as you know, play a very crucial part in our society, supporting those in need. However, we must also recognize that the very qualities that make our charities such powerful forces for good, the trust that you earn, the goodwill that you generate, and your ability to mobilize resources also make our charities attractive targets for those with malicious intentions. Now, money laundering and terrorist financing are not abstract concepts or distant threats anymore today. They are very real, and they are evolving risks that can severely undermine the integrity of our charity sector and our charities and erode the public trust that each of you have worked so hard to uphold. When a charity is exploited for these purposes, the impact extends far beyond your organization itself. It affects your beneficiaries who rely on your support. It affects your donors who entrust you with their contributions, and also our wider community that benefits from each of your charitable services. So vigilance, therefore, is not just crucial. Vigilance is your first line of defense. Now, charities must proactively mitigate these risks of your organization being misused for terrorist financing, money laundering, and other illicit activities. In so doing, you protect not just your charity and your organization and your people, but you also protect the reputation and the effectiveness of our charity sector in Singapore. So today's timely webinar aims to equip you with practical knowledge and actionable steps. Practical knowledge and actionable steps. We have representatives from MHA who will share key insights into key terrorism and terrorist financing developments, not just locally, but regionally and globally as well. The Singapore Police Force will also be sharing the importance of providing intelligence through the reporting of suspicious transactions and activities to the Suspicious Transaction Reporting Office, or STRO in short, in combating terrorism financing and money laundering. These two presentations are very important because they will tell you what is happening out there and what we each ought to do. Later in the program, you will also have the opportunity to learn from our three panelists as they discuss various scenarios, and they will also share best practices that could benefit your individual charities. I strongly urge you to ask all the questions you need via the pigeonhole and to consider how you can apply these insights to strengthen your charities. Now, since the launch of the Terrorist Financing Risk Mitigation Toolkit for charities in 2023, my office has conducted a total of 5 training sessions for over 200 charities that conduct activities or support charitable causes in or around high-risk countries or conflict areas. I'm not sure if you know, but of the 2,400 charities, we have about 200 of you who are conducting activities and your charitable causes around or in high-risk areas. So it is very important that these 200 charities, and I think you know who you are because we have been reaching out to you, to put in place all your risk mitigation policies. I will talk a little bit more about it. Now, these sessions have been, I believe, useful and instrumental in equipping these organizations with practical skills to identify, to assess, and to mitigate your heightened risk when engaging in cross-border operations, and thereby enhancing your resilience against potential terrorist financing threats. If your charity, or if you know of charities that have not attended the training session, I would strongly encourage you to do so and to encourage your friends who have not done so to come for the next training session, which will be held in the first half of this year. We will announce that date later. At the Charity Governance Conference team, Trust Matters in October last year, Minister Edwin Tong made several key announcements of initiatives that we have undertaken. Let me just quickly recap so that you know where to go to seek the resources that you need. First, we introduced the guidance template for anti-money laundering and countering the financing of terrorism policies and procedures for charities. So there is a guidance template that has been set up. We developed this template and as a valuable resource to help guide charities in establishing your policies and your procedures that are tailored to your own risk profiles. The second set of resources is ISCA's Charities, AML and CFT Services Panel, which was launched to allow our charities to tap on professional services for the conduct of due diligence screening and interpreting of these screening results. So I strongly urge you to visit ISCA's website for more information about this service. The service is there, tap on it. Thirdly, TT Foundation Advisors, which is Temasek Trust Philanthropy Advisory Service Arms, will also be launching a pilot initiative to provide due diligence services for charities, for those who need these services. More details will be shared with charities soon when TT Foundation Advisors are ready. Now, lastly, I also like to take this opportunity to remind you of a valuable resource, and I've been doing this at every webinar. Please tap on the Charities Capability Fund. Under the CCF, your charity can tap on various grants to strengthen your key governance and internal controls. We hope that you will leverage on the CCF to build your capabilities, to enhance your internal controls, to mitigate, especially as this webinar is about, the risk of money laundering and terrorist financing. Now, we are aware that some charities have been asking whether it is compulsory to put in place such money laundering or terrorist financing policies and procedures in their charities, or to conduct due diligence on the relevant stakeholders. Actually, if I may say so, I think this is the wrong question to ask. The correct question to ask ourselves is whether our charities can afford to have a money laundering or a terrorist financing case discovered in our backyard. I think that is the correct question. Now, if your answer is no, we do not want to have any such cases, that we cannot afford to have it because it will undermine the donors' confidence and our stakeholders' confidence in us, then my suggestion is for each of us who are in this position to quickly put in place our anti-money laundering and our terrorist financing policies and procedures as soon as possible, especially if our charities, especially if you're one of the 200 that operate in regions which expose you to higher risks of abuse. The toolkit is there. The guidance document is also prepared. There are also the templates that are prepared, as I mentioned earlier, and the CCF funding is available. So the toolkit, guidance document, template, and funding are available. Please utilize all of these as soon as possible because they are put there specifically to help our charities set up all their policies and put it in place. Now, I also like to remind our charities that it is, whether we are aware or not, a legal obligation to file a suspicious transaction report to the STRO office if we do find red flags of suspicious activities or transactions in our day-to-day operations. If you fail to do so, then unfortunately, it is a criminal offense if we don't do it. I think the police will explain more later. Now, such intelligence is important for the prevention, for the detection, and for the disruption of illicit activities. I hear that some charities are worried and they told us that they think that they cannot carry on activities if they go ahead and file a STRO report. The answer is no. You actually can continue your planned activities or your transaction if your charity is satisfied that you have already implemented safeguards to mitigate the risk, which means that in our daily business and our ordinary daily business of doing our work, if we discover something is strange, make that report. Just like if you discover, how come I think some money has been stolen from my safe and you can't find it, then you can make a police report. It is in some ways that way. It doesn't mean that you have done anything wrong. It just means that you have found a red flag that cropped up in the course of doing your work. So file that STRO report. I hope that clarifies. Now, I just want to urge everybody to remember that every step you take to safeguard your charity against money laundering and against terrorist financing contributes to not just a safer charity that you have, but also a more robust, a trusted, and more effective sector. If you have not done so, and you're operating in a high-risk jurisdiction, may I once again please request that you set up your AML and your CFT policies and procedures. File your STRO reports if you have to, and attend, for those who have not, the next workshop when this comes up again. Now, lastly, I just want to express my deepest appreciation to Pro Bono SG. We have worked many years with them, and I cannot help but to thank them for all the assistance they have been giving us over these years in organizing such webinars. I also like to thank MHA and police for all their help, for joining us today as our guest speakers. Behind the scenes, they have been a great help to us as well. And to our distinguished panelists, Danny, who's no stranger to us, Elaine as well, and Jason, thank you very much for taking your time to help to educate all of us on how we can do and make our charities more robust. Now, of course, Regana, for moderating our session today with aplomb. thank you for being present today. Please ask all the questions that you want answers to. We are here to help you and we'll try our best to answer it. May I once again wish you a very happy New Year and a happy Chinese New Year in advance. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Yes, we just want to make sure everyone asks as many questions as you can while you're here. But before that, let's get on to our next segment. We have Ms. Yap Ling Chuan, who will be sharing with us on the Singapore's Terrorism Financing National Risk Assessment, TFNRA for short, and the non-profit sector. Now, Ms. Yap is a senior executive at the Ministry of Home Affairs. Ms. Yap, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Regana. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Yap Ling Shen from the Ministry of Home Affairs. So first of all, please let me take a little bit of time to extend our gratitude to Pro Bono SG and the Commissioner of Charities for essentially allowing us to join today's sharing session. So I'll be sharing broadly on Singapore's TF risk and context, the terrorism financing risk of NPOs that we have identified in the Singapore's refreshed terrorism financing national risk assessment, which was published last year in July 2024, which is an update from the 2020 version, as well as the main vulnerabilities and threats that we believe domestic charities face in Singapore today. So first of all, as you can see from the slide, there is a need to understand Singapore's changing terrorism financing context. So a country's vulnerability to terrorism financing, which is also known as TF, is very closely tied to its TF threats and contextual factors. So as an open economy, Singapore's status as an international financial business and transport hub, and our geographical proximity to regions with active terrorist groups, as you can see from the map on the right, really heighten our vulnerability to TF threats. In addition, there's also the issue of Singapore emerging as a regional philanthropy hub due to our status as an international financial hub. So our key TF threats actually stem from the active terrorist groups in Southeast Asia, such as ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and Jamaat Islamiyah, also known as JI. These names should not be unfamiliar to you. We're also very affected by global developments, of course, as you know, the potential spillovers from the ongoing Israel-Hamas conflict and the tensions in the Middle East. There's also always the risk of radicalized individuals who are sympathetic to the cause of these terrorist groups, particularly ISIS. We are also starting to see far-right extremism as a growing security concern here in Singapore and in many countries worldwide. In addition, the increased digitalization in Asia over the past few years has had a significant impact on TF risk trends and typologies, both in the region and in Singapore. Notably, the COVID-19 pandemic has led to increased digitalization, better internet connectivity, and a proliferation of digital payment systems. There's an increased risk that terrorist organizations and their supporters may exploit the convenience of these new online transaction channels to further their terrorist causes overseas. So given this, the refreshed Terrorism Financing National Risk Assessment observes that the TF threat of raising and moving funds for terrorists and terrorism activities overseas from Singapore remains pertinent in Singapore's context, and self-radicalized individuals continue to pose the most salient TF threat to Singapore. So second, there's a need to understand your risk of being exploited for TF and to identify emerging TF risk areas and their impact on NPOs. So arising from the increased digitalization, Singapore's updated TF National Risk Assessment has identified new emerging areas of TF risk, namely cross-border online payments, cross-border fast payment systems, and online fundraising. You can see from the slide that online fundraising is an emerging area of risk for NPOs. However, cross-border online payments and cross-border fast payment systems similarly contribute to the risk for NPOs. Now, we recognize, as commissioners for charities said earlier, that Singapore's NPO sector is largely domestically oriented. Only 3 out of 10 charities in Singapore, so as he said earlier, about 200 plus, engage in some form of overseas work, making donations or providing funding or services to beneficiaries outside of Singapore. And an even smaller proportion of you within this group conduct these activities in higher risk jurisdictions or near conflict zones. But there's still a risk that foreign funding can flow into Singapore via our local NPO sector to support domestic terrorism-related activities, or the funds that you have raised are moved to fund terrorism-related activities abroad. So with cross-border online payments, fast payment systems, and online fundraising, it can be even more difficult for you to discern the sources of your donations. And therefore, it's all the more important for you to have appropriate AML, CFT, or anti-money laundering and counter-financing of terrorism measures in place. So this brings us to the third point, the vulnerabilities and threats faced by domestic charities today. What are the traits of vulnerable charities? If you are part of a charity that conducts activities outside of Singapore, in particular in high-risk TF jurisdictions, you're working in Indonesia or the Middle East, you're near conflict regions, you work with charities that conduct such activities, you are more vulnerable to TF. And we also recognize that the inherent challenges that are faced by charities, especially those with limited resources and lean staffing, this can reduce the effectiveness or impact of training on TF awareness and counter-financing terrorism measures, which would thereby increase the TF risk of your charity. And charities that do not conduct due diligence on their internal and external stakeholders are also at higher risk of TF. There is a need to conduct due diligence checks on key members of your charities, such as governing board members, key officers or trustees, to ensure that they have not been previously conducted of terrorism or TF, whether in Singapore or overseas. There's also a need to ensure that they have not been previously linked to terrorism or terrorism financing activities. If they have previously made extremist remarks, whether publicly or privately, we also urge you to carefully consider their position in your organization. One of the main threats to domestic charities are actually the existence of fake NPOs. So well-known charitable organizations, including yourselves, can have your names misused to raise funds. We have seen this occurring in Egypt, as you can see on the slide. Illegitimate NPOs have also been created in other jurisdictions. They can portray themselves as having legitimate causes, such as supporting refugees, but instead they're actually used for terrorism or terrorism financing activities. And they may actually even have a veneer of legitimacy by carrying out some humanitarian activities on the side. This can make your charity's task of conducting due diligence more difficult. Another pertinent threat to domestic charities are actually self-radicalized individuals who may seek to misuse your organization for terrorism or terrorism financing purposes. So this is actually a case that occurred in Singapore, which we think is a good example of how your charities can be misused by self-radicalized individuals. The man was a former managing director of a local logistics company. He acted as an intermediary between a local humanitarian group and two foreign aid organizations. And unbeknownst to the local NPO, the two foreign aid organizations were actually linked to terrorism. The man traveled to Turkey with the aid of the NPO that he's working with, and he actually intended to slip away from his host, but it was actually thanks to their vigilance that he reported that he never had the opportunity to do so. So there are a few learning points that can be gleaned from this incident. Self-radicalized individuals are indeed a real threat to NPOs and to your organization, and they can and will seek to use your organization for terrorism or terrorism financing purposes. It is very important to conduct due diligence on your partners, whether it's your local liaison partners or your foreign partners. If you do work overseas, do ensure that there's a trusted representative of your organization there who can ensure that the beneficiaries are legitimate and humanitarian activities are being carried out. All of the donated items or funds are going directly to the beneficiaries and no one slips away in the dark of the night. So you might be thinking, well, my organization is completely focused on Singapore. Well, what does any of this have to do with me? So they can still infiltrate your organizations, and they can and have been known overseas to divert funds from NPOs from within the organization towards terrorism and terrorism financing purposes. You might recall from one of our first slides that we have a number of active terrorist groups such as Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and JI in Southeast Asia. These groups have also been known to target Singapore and do view us as very much as a prize target. So self-radicalized individuals can work with these groups to conduct attacks in Singapore and use your organization as a source of funding. With the advent of AI, deepfakes, your charity's name and image can also be used to appeal for donations. It is also important to dispel any prejudices when it comes to terrorism financing. Most of us still think of ISIS at first thought, but right-wing extremism, as we raised earlier, is also on the rise. All of these factors combined could result in your charity being exploited for terrorism financing, even if you are domestically oriented. And with the rapid technological developments being made, they will find new ways of exploiting the system. So this brings us to the most important point. How do we combat this? How do we ensure, and how do you ensure that your charity is not misused for terrorism or terrorism financing purposes. So we very much strongly encourage you to be aware of your risks. The Terrorism Financing Risk Mitigation Toolkit released by the COC in February 2023 will go a long way in helping you assess your risk, and it has ready templates for your charities use in this endeavor. It also provides you with common terrorism financing typologies and provides guidance on which of the officers in your organization should be involved in the exercise. As mentioned earlier, we have also published a terrorism financing national risk assessment. So it's actually available at the QR code at the leftmost QR code. We highly encourage you to read the section on NPOs to be aware of your latest risk. Don't worry, it's only 5.5 pages. You may also read the other sections if those sectors have any intersection with your organization. So for example, you might wish to read the section on banks. If your charity accepts cryptocurrency, you may also wish to read the section on cryptocurrency. We have also accordingly refreshed our national strategy for countering the financing of terrorism, which you may also find useful in the center QR code. So once you are aware of your risk, please put in place appropriate risk mitigation measures. The level of risk mitigating measures required for every organization is different. If after assessing your risk using a toolkit, you realize that your organization's risk is low, then the level of counter-terrorism financing measures you should put in place is also low. But vice versa also applies. If your organization has high risk, please put in place more stringent measures. This is why understanding your risk is so important. It ensures that the resources, which we all know are stretched in charities, can be appropriately distributed. And lastly, when in doubt about the sources in funds, please file a suspicious transaction report, which is also known as an STR. I'll leave it to my colleague from CAD later to expound on this. If you come across impersonation of your charities, file a police report. This will enable our law enforcement authorities to investigate and determine if there's any instances of wrongdoing. So we would also like to see your aid to scan the rightmost QR code to provide feedback on whether this session has been useful, so we can improve on future sessions. Thank you, and we look forward to continuing our close partnership in the ongoing whole of society fight towards terrorism and terrorism financing.
Thank you very much, Ms. Yap, for that very detailed sharing. Fast forward 1 year today, we've come full circle with a stronger foundation and new resources to empower charities. In the recently published guidance template on AML-CFT policies and procedures for charities, published in October 2024, if I'm not wrong, and the risk mitigation toolkit for charities is now available to support your organizations in implementing robust measures. Today's webinar, and I echo Commissioner's words, is to empower you with knowledge and give you actionable steps. And with that, I have an amazing panel with me today of Ms. Elaine Chan, Mr. Danny Ong, and Mr. Jason Tan. Elaine, hello, welcome. Elaine is a board director of Charities Humanitarian Aid and Relief Initiatives Singapore Limited, also the co-head of the Financial Services Regulatory Practice at Wong Partnership LLP, recognized as a leading lawyer by the Chambers Global and the IFLR 1000 Women Leaders. Elaine's expertise is well acknowledged in the financial services sector. She was also, fun fact, involved in co-developing the guidance template for the anti-money laundering and counter-financing of terrorism policies for charities. Thank you very much for being here. And Danny, familiar face, is the managing director of Satya Law and brings a wealth of experience in law, commercial acumen, and strategic wisdom. He is particularly known for his expertise in international fraud and financial crime, and is recognized amongst the global elite and as one of the 40 global thought leaders in fraud and asset recovery field. Recently, he has pioneered fraud and asset recovery in the digital asset space, and also has been lead counsel in many landmark judgments from the Singapore courts. Hi, Danny. Nice to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Rebecca.
And Jason. Now, Jason is a partner and the head of forensics at KPMG Singapore. He has extensive experience leading anti-money laundering reviews, fraud and corruption investigation, and dispute advisory engagements. Now, Also, another fun fact, Jason was involved in the publication of the Terrorist Financing Risk Mitigation Toolkit for Charities and was also part of the Anti-Money Laundering and Countering the Financing of Terrorism Industry ACIP working groups. Now, thank you all for being here. And for our audience who did not manage to catch the webinar in 2023, not to worry. We will share with you the link a little bit later. So, as charities, we are very deeply committed to addressing social and humanitarian needs. However, these very qualities that make charities impactful, such as high public trust, extensive networks, and global operations, also makes them vulnerable to risk, like money laundering and terrorist financing. So through some case scenarios today, we will walk through the challenges a charity would face, the actionable insights to strengthen your AML CFT measures, and to safeguard the integrity of all our organizations here. So before we start our case scenario, actually, Danny, we have a question for you, and I thought you could give us sort of a launching pad into the scenarios. And the question is, money laundering is a process of concealing illicit obtained money through placement, layering, integration. How would charities be used to cover dirty money or convert, dirty money into clean money and return it back to the criminal?
There are various ways. Thanks, Rogana. That's a big question to ask to kick off the session. But let me just give you an example out of many multiple ways. One scheme that is employed and can be employed, actually, it's an overpayment scheme. So take, for example, a donor who's purporting to or pretending to in more simple terms, to donate 100,000 to a particular charity. Then after payment into the charity's bank account, claims that there was an overpayment, and then there was a mistake. Actually, it was a rounding error of a couple of zeros, and actually only intended to pay $1,000, donate $1,000, and then ask for a refund. And the refund is asked to be designated and repaid to another bank account or another digital asset wallet, and so on and so forth, whichever means that they want it, in somebody else's name. And through that simple example and that simple mechanism, it then gets laundered through a charity. Now, that is obviously a very simplistic example, but there are many multiple ways. And imagine if that was a scheme that was multiplied across 1,000 charities, utilizing and taking advantage of 1,000 charities' payment platforms. Then, the numbers add up.
Okay, that's very interesting. And I think with that, let's start with our first case scenario. It was indeed a launching pad, because I think we should look at the first case scenario, which is about Charity A, and it should be coming up on the screen right now. Now, Charity A is a mid-sized non-profit organization, receives an anonymous donation of 300,000. And this is very significant to quite a lot of charities. The funds are routed through a family office, which is, I think, Elaine, you would agree, there's a lot of family offices popping now up in Singapore. Absolutely. And it's transferred from an international bank account located in a high-risk jurisdiction. While the donation presents an opportunity to support Charity A's program substantially, the lack of transparency surrounding the donor raises flags. And I think we have covered what red flags are. So the charity of the board is divided. Some really want that money because, it can really support the outreach program. And some are concerned about the potential risk. Will it affect their reputation? Are there legal risks? So now the board is really faced with a critical decision, right? Should they accept, proceed cautiously, report it as a suspicious transaction, and give up the funding? So, Elaine, I want to ask you a very important question. As a board of director with extensive experience, what governance framework should Charity A have in place to evaluate such a donation coming in, handle such a high value anonymous donation, and when you're managing the board as well?
All very valid questions, Rogana. Well, let's start off with how Charity A should handle this high value donation, and what sort of internal processes it would need to have. I think primarily it's very important to have due diligence processes in place, which enable the charity to know who the donor is and to understand what the risks are of money laundering and terrorism financing in dealing with this donor. And, you know, with that kind of insight, I think the board of Charity A will be better equipped, right, to decide how they want to deal with this donation, right? Whether it is to file the STR or whether it's reasonable to accept the donation, and, you know, what sort of measures they might need to put into place to manage the risks arising from that high value donation. Now, I know it's pretty daunting, right, for charities with limited resources to try and put into place internal policies and procedures. I mean, charities have much more better things to do. But, you know, I was very glad to be able to work with the charities unit to co-develop the guidance template. And that guidance template actually sets out the key elements of a risk-based due diligence framework that charities can put into place to conduct that due diligence on donors. Now, we always know that charities have limited resources and risk-based processes are important. So one way that charities can try and calibrate this risk-based due diligence framework is to actually establish criteria, right? So you could set a quantitative criteria, right? Such as if the donation exceeds the typical amounts that their usual donor base would contribute, then this should trigger the need for due diligence. Or you could use qualitative factors such as, hey, is this donor known to me? Is this donor credible in the charities ecosystem? And if not, then that could trigger due diligence, right? So coming back to the case study, you'd see that there are these factors, there are these exceptional factors, right? It's a very high value donation, possibly beyond what the charity usually receives. And it is from someone that's unknown, right? So that two factors should tend towards the need for Charity A to conduct due diligence. I also wanted to just give some broad pointers as to what these due diligence steps would entail. And these are all actually set out in the guidance template. But just to give everyone a quick overview, in general, that sort of due diligence should involve collecting identity information from your donor. And there are guidance on what sort of info you want to collect. But not only that, steps should also be taken to verify, corroborate the information.
So
right?
then that brings me to a quick question.
Yep.
Someone asked, can they collect IC from the donor because of PDPA, you know? So
Well, okay, that's a PDPA question, but actually from the PDA perspective, to collect personal data, well, as long as the donor provides it to you, then, you know, you're allowed to collect that information. And of course, in assessing, right, the reasonableness of the donation, you would need to get the info from the donor. Of course, if the donor says no, then that's also another suspicious factor, right? Yeah.
okay.
So well, generally, those are the key steps in due diligence. But I also wanted to leave with two other points, which was that if there are further red flags, as in this case scenario, it does demonstrate that, given that you have money coming through a third party, and there's money that's coming in from a high-risk jurisdiction, that's where additional due diligence measures are needed, right?
Okay.
And these additional measures are intended to assess who is behind, lifting the veil as to who is behind, right? The donor or the family office, to understand who the beneficial owners are, who their connected persons are, and really carrying out screening to assess that they are legitimate. And perhaps even in this instance, checking and corroborating the source of wealth and source of funds. The guidance template does set out guidelines on how you do that. So suggest that charities may want to look at the guidance template for further information around that. So I think with that, that should, you know, give Charity A the necessary information to decide how they want to proceed.
So for example, in this case scenario, it was 300,000. There was a question about how about if the amount is really small? Say, I'm assuming 100, 500. Do they really have to go and research on the donor, find out all these things? Any comments from the panel?
I think you take it from a pragmatic point of view, right? I mean, it's $500. The amount of work that goes into it, I mean, there are still risks. So it's a risk mitigation, risk assessment exercise, and I think the question really is it worth the trouble? I would say. I mean, ask that pragmatic question. Do you want to go through the same hoops? Because, you know, if it's actually tainted, and is actually a small bit. If it's 500, I think it's not just a 500 question. It's the reputational impact of it if that risk is assumed and something actually blows up in the charities faces. But is that 500 then split into other chunks of 500 from other seemingly unconnected sources? And actually the 500 actually adds up to 500,000, but it's all tainted from the same source, right? So it is not quite simplistic as looking at it as, oh, 500, I'll just take that risk, or 500, I'll just reject. Yeah.
Okay.
So I think to add to that as well as what Danny has shared, so I think we get this question quite often when we conduct training for charities in relation to the terrorism financing risk mitigation toolkit. Is there a threshold we should be focusing on, looking at? Unfortunately, there is no black and white answer to this. It's not possible to assign a threshold simply because every charity is different, the size, scale, operation is different. And also to the point earlier, right? I think if we were to look at this case scenario and we were to just replace the 300,000 with 500, yes, there are other risk indicators like routing through a family office. Though one will also wonder, if it's for any money laundering purposes, would that make sense cost-wise? The second thing is we may be able to, based on the risk assessment, decide that maybe in this instance it is okay, but there should be a way to also monitor for future activities. So you can imagine if someone is trying to launder money or finance terrorists, they will need to also find a way that they believe can work in the long term. So quite often they may also try bite-sized transactions to test out the controls of the charity. So it's important to also consider, whether this is a transaction that repeats itself. Do you see this particular donor keep coming back in and putting in more money? And if so, I think then the risk assessment has to be reassessed by the charity.
I think to echo COC's words, being vigilant, right? So Elaine, anything else to add before I ask Danny a little bit more tougher questions?
I think absolutely the risk-based framework is an important approach to adopt, right? Because different charities have different scale. And depending on your scale, that's when you decide whether a donation has suspicious features. And obviously, if there are notable and suspicious features, then that's where it triggers that need to really look at it carefully, really do your due diligence and consider whether an enhanced level of due diligence is required, like going back, looking at the controllers, and then assessing the source of funds and source of wealth.
Okay, so next question for Danny, taking a step back into the case scenario. And I also actually have a question that sort of links to my first question, which is from a legal standpoint, what are Charities A's obligation or any charity under the Singapore's AML, CFT laws in this scenario for reporting? What are their obligations or consequences actually?
Yeah, so let's all take a step back, right? I think all these regulatory obligations and compliance needs must be first seen and understood in the context of what's wrong. What is the wrong that's sought to be addressed? And really it's retention of criminal proceeds, right? Assisting another person to retain or distribute criminal proceeds, and assisting another or yourself possessing and coming into possession of assets or property which constitute proceeds of crime, and relatedly monies which are used to fund terrorist activities. So that's really the backdrop against which we need to see what we're trying to do here and what your obligations are, and what risks are attendant from that. So against the backdrop, when we talk about STR and suspicions, there's really suspicions on that front. Suspicions, reasonable suspicions that it may be proceeds of crime, reasonable suspicion that it might be the monies may be used and being channeled for purposes of terrorist financing. Reasonable suspicion that actually the asset that is being routed through you constitute proceeds of crime. If there's any instance whereby there is basis to suspect that, then that's when the obligation arises, right? Because not so much the obligation in and of itself, but it's really the risk that you might actually be helping the criminals or the criminal organizations or the terrorist organizations route the illicit monies.
So then my follow-up question is, let's say they've done the checks, it seems legit, they've accepted the donation, they've used it for their outreach program, then down the road, something happens, news hits the fan in that way that, wow, these guys received monies for AML or TF, what happens to the charity then?
Oh, well, I think whatever measures an organization takes, no matter the largest bank in Asia or a small charity, I think there will be situations where things do fall through the cracks, not because it's for lack of trying or lack of diligence, but there's no foolproof way, right? To prove something. And particularly when it's deliberately designed to obfuscate the original source or the original connections. But I think the question really, as the toolkit suggests, right, and it lays out all kinds of recommendations for the charities to take up, is what steps have you taken, and have you taken reasonable diligence, proper due diligence, made the proper inquiries in the context of the facts. So coming back to the case scenario, you have a family office, right? Who's behind the family office? Who are the officers of the family office? Which bank account did it come from? And why route it through? I mean, if it's, let's use a hypothetical, it's a Wong, some famous Wong family from some other jurisdiction that is supposed to be a billionaire. Are the Wong family members part of the family office? Are they directors there? And behind it, is it held by a trust foundation? Where's the trust registered? Who's the trustee of it? Is it Bank of New York trustee or HSBC trustee, or is it some trustee that you never heard of, right? And if the money comes from Singapore, another Singapore bank as compared to, in this case, in the scenario, a high-risk jurisdiction, some small island in some faraway place that is well known and is on the FATF blacklist, right? Then alarm bells ring. So it's how, in that context, what are the questions you're asking? What is your team doing to ask those questions? What are the supporting documentation that you've asked for and you've received to satisfy yourself? And I think the bottom line is that if you've done your homework properly, and thoroughly and sensibly applying common sense to close the gaps, then I think the fact that 2 years later, there's this big case and actually it turns out that the charity, some monies are routed through, then I think the risks are mitigated.
Yeah, I think asking those questions at the very beginning really helps.
And keeping an audit trail of that, because 2-3 years later, and it might be 5 years later, that the authorities come and knock on your door and say, hey, you received 500 grand, right? Where did it come from and what diligence did you do? And then you should have a dossier, not a dossier because I'm old, but an electronic file in your database where you can pull up from the server and say, hey, I've actually done all these things. And in some cases where the amounts are large, you have actually outsourced it to a compliance service provider to do extra checks of this. You even gone to the office to knock on the doors and take photos. Now that whole file is in your server, in your database, and can be pulled out. So that audit trail is very important for risk management as well.
I still use a dossier word, so you're not the only one who's old here. Before I get to Jason, actually, I have a question which I thought was very good. And maybe Elaine, I will ask you, as a charity, how do we conduct due diligence? Or is there any tool, maybe also for Jason to think about, to run checks on board members, right? To check if they had affiliation to any terrorist groups, for instance. It's quite a good question. So Elaine or Jason? Elaine? Jason?
Sure. I think in all the documents, the references, the toolkits that have been shared earlier, there is also a provision of the accesses to tools, databases that one can use to check against those. So Singapore in particular, we follow United Nations sanctions, right? So that is actually available in the website that's also been shared in the toolkit. So you can actually do a quick search and query on those. Secondly, you can also subscribe to commercial databases. So there are service providers out there that actually provide this as a service. So you can actually subscribe, can screen the name. So if there's any concerns around sanctions, politically exposed persons, not to say it's always wrong to deal with a PEP, just that in some contexts and in some countries and locations, it may be higher risk to do so. And of course, consideration of whether there's any adverse information in relation to the individual. And last but not least, I understand ISCA has also partnered with the COC and MCCY to provide low Bono services for screening. So there are a few service providers that can actually provide the screening services for charities as well.
Thank you, Jason. Elaine, anything to add on that?
I suppose for completeness, perhaps I'll say something about the best practices, right, that charities may need to consider more holistically. So I talked about due diligence on donors, but I realized I also wanted to mention that charities actually deal with a whole range of stakeholders, isn't it? They deal with beneficiaries and from time to time also partners, and it's also very important that the due diligence covers these stakeholders as well. I mean, in respect of beneficiaries, you'd want to be conducting your due diligence to ensure that they satisfy the selection criteria that the charity may have put into place, as well as also ascertaining that they are good standing. And that due diligence will essentially cover the screening process, right? Verifying the identity information, and also from time to time updating that, right, as the charity continues engaging these beneficiaries or other stakeholders. So that's on the due diligence front. But also on an ongoing basis, I also wanted to mention that it's very important to undertake continuing monitoring as well, right? And this is important really to ensure that charitable funds are being used in a manner that they're intended to be used, aligned with the charitable objectives, and also to ensure that ultimately, right, there's no money laundering or terrorism financing that's taking place. In respect of monitoring, I think there are various key measures that need to be implemented by charities, and that will go into proper record keeping, right? Checking that there are records in place to ensure that the funds have gone into the intended purposes or have been paid to the intended beneficiaries. But not only that, perhaps depending on the size of the charitable project, for example, if it's some reconstruction efforts, right, in a foreign country, then perhaps more proactive monitoring needs to be undertaken. And that could include, getting progress reports on the progress, on the expenditures, as well as perhaps getting video footage or photographs or even testimony from your beneficiaries, because I think that's always very important for verification purposes, but also very heartwarming when you realize the type of good you've done, right, with charitable funds. And so that's key. Holistically, proper record keeping is important. And I think that's where governance and accountability comes in, when you have proper records that show, the decisions made or the rationale for certain donations with funny or unusual factors, I would say, suspicious factors, or where you asked to do something relating to a conditional, repayment or refund, right? So that's where it's very important to have documentation to show that the board has really thought about it and they have reasons and have measures in place to protect themselves from harm. That would be, and those good.
Okay, so Jason,
practices.
before I'm going to ask you a question,
Sure.
there's something that I thought was a very interesting question, and I'll ask Danny first. Let's say, for example, if the donation came from a family office, but it was transferred to a charity through a third-party platform, for example, giving.sg. Who is responsible to file the suspicious transaction?
Actually, every organization or platform that through which the monies are routed would have that obligation. So, or that responsibility. So it falls on whoever the money, is routed through. So whether it's Giving SG, that is the platform through which the monies are routed, or the original platform through, from which the monies came into Giving SG.
Okay.
I think it's at every level, unfortunately, or fortunately.
Okay, back to you, Jason. And coming back to the case scenario, because we have some really great questions coming in. Mr. Lim just now shared a little bit about what to look out for, red flags. But in this instance, is there any specific red flags that we might have missed? Or something else that comes to mind that you could share with us that might warrant further scrutiny, when receiving such a donation?
So I think off the face of it, we have already as a panel already discussed materially all the red flags. So routing through a family office, which creates a bit of opaqueness in terms of who the ultimate donor is, account in a high risk jurisdiction. So that's another red flag as well. Personally, when I look at the risks that may be associated with any transactions or charity, and because we had that 3 billion case in Singapore in 2023, I personally was on an informal basis asked to speak to a few And I sat down with them. The very first question I asked them is, do your donors have the ability to influence who the beneficiaries are? And what kind of benefits do your beneficiaries receive, right? So if I can use an example, I was speaking to an organization that was looking to provide affordable preschool childcare for children. So essentially, their beneficiaries are low-income families, and the donations they receive, which can be anonymous from time to time, can be fruit products, supplies, right? So people just leave it there because in the school they cook for the kids as well. So the cash donations are very rare. And the beneficiaries are obviously they vetted through to establish that yes, they're eligible, and they do need support. So in that context, so long as you have a good understanding of who your beneficiaries are, and you are clear that the monies that you're receiving in terms of donations has a very low risk of being routed elsewhere. Because if you think about it, money launderers, terrorists, they need the money to fulfill their end objective. So they need the money to be able to go in the circle and come back to themselves. So if there's no ability for them to influence who the beneficiaries are, that ability by them is very much reduced, and therefore the risk and attractiveness of it as a tool to them is very much reduced as well. So whenever I look at a particular transaction, I always have this thought in my head to think about, is there a way that the donor can have a unreported, undisclosed relationship with the beneficiary, right? Because if you want to have the ability to get the money back to yourself, you will need to conceal the relationship, and therefore can do that undetected. So if I look at the way the charity works, the beneficiaries it is meant to support, it doesn't provide that for the kind of mechanism, then I would think that the risk is lower. So for me, that's one of the things I will also consider. Not explicitly call in this case scenario, but for me, I will also want to know who are the beneficiaries that will be receiving the benefits from the donation, whether there could be a potential link between that beneficiary and the donor at the end.
So, I mean, Jason, that's a very good point. I mean, if you take that scenario that you painted and apply it against the case scenario, the money comes in and the verification exercise is done, and it's not fully satisfactory, but it looks all right in simple terms. I mean, one of the questions you're therefore suggesting is then the next question is asked is that, is there real risk of laundering or terrorist financing here? Because the money is not going to go out anywhere. It's immediately going to use by me, the charity, to buy food for a whole bunch of donees and beneficiaries, and that is a key factor in the consideration, isn't it? Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
I mean, it's a balancing exercise, and in that context, although you may not have 100%, satisfied yourselves that the money is clean, so to speak, and you may well never be able to do that. And that, I think, happens on a daily basis. Then it's a judgment call. And I think against that context, your judgment is like, look, where's the money going to go? I'm going to go buy bread and eggs and everything for the needy. And that's it. It's not as if there will be leakage that will go out and there's no laundering exercise here. It might well have originated as proceeds of crime, but I'm not able to verify that. Yeah.
Understand. Elaine, anything else to add?
Yeah, I think I'll just add one thing, which is that in that kind of circumstance, right, where there is that possibility, but you can't say conclusively that that's the case, then perhaps one mitigating measure to protect yourself would be perhaps to ring fence the funds for a period of time within which you would then assess whether there's anything else coming in or reports out there. And once you're satisfied that over that period, then go ahead to deploy the funds. Perhaps that's one way to safeguard yourself. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Elaine and Jason, I would like to really reference the toolkit and the guidance template. Just want to ask both of you, looking at the case scenario or anything the charities should know, taking in reference, like which page they should go, if you can remember which page, but if not, if there is a specific thing they should look out for in the toolkit. So maybe I'll start with Jason first.
Sure. I think the toolkit is not meant to be exhaustive, right? So, when we started on this journey, as everyone can appreciate, I think the overall intent is to create awareness. That's step one. Because we are as a a sector, the charity sector, the intent is always to do good. So perhaps at the back of the mind, very far behind the back of the mind, is that potentially charities can be misused by money launderers and terrorists. So when we started this, I think it was something that people hasn't really thought much about, and it was a bit of creating more of the awareness. So the toolkit for terrorism financing risk mitigation essentially is setting out examples of how charities can be misused for terrorism, how the funds can be actually be routed to terrorist groups, whilst having a very legitimate front. Also sharing some of the indicators, red flags that one should look out for and consider. It's also a template that actually encourages the charities to proactively think about, first of all, have I gone about identifying my risks in relation to terrorism financing? Have I then think about what are the risk mitigating controls that can be put in place? So very importantly, the very first step is always to have a good understanding of the risk that your charity is exposed to. Because if you don't have that, you cannot even think about, what kind of risk mitigation measures I need to have in place. So the toolkit is meant to kind of drive that thought process, risk identification. Once you identify, you then think about what are the mitigating controls that you need to put in place. Then after that, you need to think about, okay, how do I then monitor this on an ongoing basis? So if the charity, there are some changes to the nature of the charity, the beneficiaries that is supporting, for example, the jurisdictions that is now supporting, extending its support to, all this can have a change in the risk associated with this charity or the partners that you're working with as well. So that will call for reassessment of the risk. And last but not least, not to say that we always need to look for someone to be responsible for something, it's important to also identify risk and control owners. Not simply because we need someone to be blamed, but more importantly, if we never say out clearly who is responsible for what, things often fall through the cracks because we assume that someone else is looking at it and it has all been covered. So the toolkit is meant to help drive that process. But unfortunately, as you can appreciate, there's 2,000 charities in Singapore. So how are we going to be able to formulate a template that's able to be applicable to everyone? It's just not possible. But the toolkit will enable each charity to kickstart that thought process. And then based on your own operation needs, your size, the beneficiaries you support, whether it's local, overseas, you can then, conclude on your own basis and assessment, what's the risk that the charity is exposed to. So I highly encourage everyone who has not done so to take reference to the toolkit.
Thank you, Jason. Elaine.
So following on from Jason's point, I think for charities looking to develop their internal policies and procedures, it is important to start off with that risk assessment using that toolkit. And the charity that I sit on, we actually underwent that process by pulling together on an organizational wide basis, all the different personnel from the different operational areas. So from fundraising, from finance, from the grants side of things, we all came together and just, put our heads together to think about how, our operations are conducted and to think about the various gaps where these potential money laundering or terrorism financing risks could arise. And then with that insight, we did go about thinking harder about the measures. And then with that, we went about documenting, I suppose, our internal policies and procedures. And today we do have something in place. But speaking from the perspective of having prepared that guidance template, I think that's a good sort of starting point as well for charities to take guidance from in terms of how they might want to develop their policies and procedures. But obviously, there are many charities conducting in different shapes and forms, right? So looking at how their activities are conducted, then they will need to do the adaptation and customization so that the policies are suitable, right, fit for use for their specific charity. The guidance template does set out all the key elements of the different best practices that charities can put into place. So it covers, the due diligence aspect, covering what sort of information you might want to be gathering and how you might be checking and corroborating the information against specific documents to check that it's all there, or you might want to be looking at certain reliable sources, and we've got certain links in there for you to look at. And then in terms of screening, if you're not relying on a screening service, then we've also got links in there where you can screen against, the relevant UN lists of designated persons and individuals, or the terrorism financing list. So with that screening, you can then assess the good standing, right, of your stakeholders. And so, take reference to the guidance template. We put in a lot of thought in there to try and give guidance so that charities can think about how they want to customize. We also put in sources there that they can refer to, which hopefully will help to make the process less painful. So hopefully that will be very helpful to everyone.
I think that's the key word, less painful. On that note, there was a question actually, Jason, I think you've been highlighting about training, right? Empowering staff, stakeholders. So this question is actually really quite important. What type of AML or CTF training should be provided to different stakeholders, for example, fundraising staff, board members, volunteers, frontline staff?
So I think the training generally, from my experience, there will be your standard, if I can call it, the 101 AML CFT training, right? So that's generally delivered to everyone within the charity. I believe personally for frontline staff, there should be added additional tailored training in relation to the kind of activities that's specific and unique to the charity itself. Because the frontliners are the ones that are interacting with the donors, the volunteers, the beneficiaries. So you think about it, they are likely the first line of defense. So if there's any unusual behavior, activity and whatnot, well, I hate to say this, but I think there is a huge reliance on them to be able to, first of all, identify this is somewhat amiss, right? And be able to identify that and escalate further for further consideration. So in terms of the training from the frontliners, I think it needs to go a bit beyond what is money laundering, what is proper AML CFT framework. It should also focus on, what are the possible red flag behavior and whatnot you should look out for when you're dealing with the parties that are connected to the charity. For board level, generally it's more in relation to governance. How do you demonstrate, or how do you satisfy yourself that you have a good understanding of the effectiveness of the AML CFT framework across the charity? How do you get information from the charity itself to know that the risk is being managed? So I would say for the board, usually we focus more on the thematic risks that may be prevalent in any given year. For example, earlier our colleagues shared about the National Risk Assessment on Terrorism Financing. So whenever that's published, I think it's good to update the board on that. And also to know whether, the charity is operating in any high-risk jurisdictions, and if so, what are the kind of monitoring mechanisms in place, and whether there's anything that may be falling short in terms of control effectiveness. Those are the information and training that should be provided to the board level.
Thanks, Jason. And I mean, Elaine, as a board member, what training have you gotten, if I can ask? Or what is the charity planning to do with, any suggestions for our charities out there who are planning for their board members?
I think it's important, definitely, from an organizational-wide perspective, to have those training sessions where your staff are aware of what they have to do, how to recognize suspicious transactions or suspicious circumstances. And that's we've also put that into place in our charity. Actually, I was giving the training. But on the board level, absolutely agree with what Jason says. It's all about governance, right? And the importance of having those criteria in place. What sort of criteria do you think is important for your charity in assessing some of the high-risk donations that you may receive? Or if the charity is thinking about conditional, sort of accepting conditional donations, then what sort of processes? So I think it's that sort of learning, I suppose, that directors may need to have, right, to become more apprised of the risk, and then to be able then to think through in terms of their, activities, how then would they approach it? What then would they need to put into place?
Okay. Before we move on to the next case scenario, Danny, there's a question, and I'm really trying to figure out how you're going to be answering this. But let me ask, by adding a clause that says donations are not refundable Will this be considered best practice?
Well, I think it's really down to the commercials in terms of the charity, right? I mean, if you've got 10 charities and 9 of them are saying that it's refundable, and you're the one that stands out and says, sorry, I'm not going to refund you. So that's really a commercial lens to it. But in terms of risk mitigation, sure. I think absolutely. I mean, just say sorry. I mean, if it's a rounding error, then that's too bad for you. But is that real? I mean, if it's a rounding error between 100 and $10, maybe not. But if it's 100 and 100,000, you've got to manage your stakeholders, and the key stakeholders, obviously your donor. So I think it's not quite real. The reality is that it might actually land you in more difficulty or more of a spot, because you have a clause then that says non-refundable. The reality is that everybody's going to be jumping and putting pressure on you and saying, hey, it's a lot of money. This is my big donor. He or she says it's a mistake, right? And they only intended to give you 10,000 and not 100,000. Are you not going to refund it despite your terms? Then you start having the reverse difficulty of having to justify, oh, now I'm refunding because. And then you take on the burden on yourself and say, I now have to satisfy for sure that I'm not refunding for purposes of facilitating laundering. Right? When in fact, actually, it was an honest, legitimate, the person is of a proper background and you've checked everything out. There was no basis for suspicion and it was just pure innocent request for refunds. So you might be actually trying to be clever about it and get ahead of it. And kudos to you if you're thinking about that. And that's a very good question and idea. But I think it's not quite as simple. Right? And I think that also ties in with a point I wanted to add to what Elaine and Jason said about training, right? In that context, you've got the theory, the concepts, and scenario simulations provided to the frontline in particular. But ultimately, it's almost putting on an investigator's hat, having a sense, like the investigators do, building the ability to do sense check and to smell. Have that nose to be able to smell and sense, hey, something's not quite right. You might not know what questions to ask further, but at least you know your senses are alerted, and then you know that something needs to be done. And I think it's a lot, and you wouldn't be able to predict the scenarios. But I think the level of training is not just theoretical; it's actually practical, and having practical application in real life. Yeah.
I have another question, and I don't know if we can ever get to scenario B, but I thought this was really interesting, and I'm really appreciative of our audience sending all these questions. The charity has said we do not fundraise that much. Does this mean the risk is lowered? Jason?
Do not fundraise that
Yeah,
much.
they don't constantly fundraise. So
I think, okay, so from a monitoring standpoint, if you don't have frequent fundraisers, it certainly means that it's easier to identify any anomaly. So for example, in this case scenario, let's say the charity doesn't do a lot of fundraising, suddenly out of the blue, they receive 300,000 in cash, right? So that will really stick out like a sore thumb and people will take notice. If you are a charity that has a lot of funding, events, activities, and donations are coming, high volume, high frequency, high value, then obviously there is more complexity in being able to find something that is out of the norm. So I would say from that standpoint, probably the job is easier in terms of being able to detect any anomalous transactions or donations. But I wouldn't just blanket to say that, oh, because I don't have a lot of fundraising activities, therefore my risk is low and therefore I don't have to pay any attention.
Actually, it's the opposite, Regana and Jason, right? So in your scenario where you don't fundraise much and then suddenly you have 500,000 coming in, which is 500,000 through one donor, which is the first time in 5 years or something like that, the risk is actually a lot more, because the point is that you should be more alert and you should be more suspicious of that. Rather than the high volume, every day I receive $1,000, and in that scenario, the basis for suspicion is less. So actually, ironically, the fact that you don't fundraise much and then you get a lot of money suddenly from one source or even 10 sources, actually alarm bells should ring. Yeah.
And I wanted to also add that due diligence is not just limited to donors, right? Because you've got to also understand who your beneficiaries are, right? Especially if you are going to be sending a huge amount to your beneficiaries. So I think it's important to look more holistically around how your business is conducted and consider the need for due diligence.
So on actually Danny's point and all your point, if you don't fundraise that often, you become complacent and you being like, okay, I don't no need to my checks and balances. Suddenly you get hit by a great big number donation. What are you going to do, right? So yes, it might slip through the cracks. Our participants have decided to give me charity C, skipping charity B. So I'm going to ask a question here, and it's very interesting. Charity C receives a donation from a well-respected individual in Singapore, but was alerted that this donation may be part of a proceeds from a sale of a GCB. So I was told GCB means good class bungalow, to a trust based in a Swiss bank for an extremely high price. The identity of the ultimate beneficial owner is not disclosed. Does the charity have the obligation to find out the ultimate beneficial owner who bought the GCB, since the funds are going into the charity? And how can the charity go about finding this information? My panel has gone quiet.
Yeah. Okay, I'm trying to also understand whether I understand the question fully in its complete entirety. So the charity is receiving funds from the sale of a GC.
Yes.
Part of the process, right?
Yes.
Okay.
So the property is sold by a Singapore billionaire, right, to a Swiss trust, right, whose settlor and beneficiary is not known.
Yep. Okay.
It comes from a Swiss bank account because they're proceeds of the sale. And then it's routed by the individual through, let's say, the Singapore lawyers who deal with the sale and purchase transaction into the charity. I mean, how the charity knows it came from the Swiss trust is questionable, but that's the scenario.
Okay.
So the question really then is, do you have to look behind the billionaire seller, and how in real terms are you going to knock on the door to the billionaire seller and say, thank you, I love your $1 million, but I need to ask who's the seller who's the buyer of your wonderful GCB for $100 million.
Is the charity obligated to ask such a question?
I would say, it's going to be sounding like a very politically correct answer, but I think in the spirit of wanting to really mitigate the risk, we should always ask. I think on a reasonable basis, whether we can get an honest answer and a complete answer. I think that's not always going to be the perfect scenario. But
yeah, I would add also, I mean, pragmatically, I think Jason is quite right. The buyer, the Singapore billionaire buyer, as much as he or she is a billionaire, would have had to verify and satisfy him or herself of the legitimacy of the sources of the fund from the Swiss trust, right? So first of all, by in colloquial lay terms, by right, the billionaire should have that information on hand, or his or her lawyers should have the information on hand, or the bankers should have the information on hand already. And so that it would then, the question then, if you ask and there's a pushback, then it raises the question, why are you pushing back?
Yeah.
Right. And it's an entirely legitimate question, and you should have that information already. So I think that's one of those things where you ask, and I think Jason's quite right. Ask, right? See what the response is, and the response is no. Why are you concerned on donating money to you? Then I think it raises even more questions than answers. Yeah.
Elaine?
I think I totally agree with the two panelists. Politically correct answer, but I think if we're in it to reduce risk of money laundering and terrorism financing, then absolutely, assessing source of funds is very important.
I have one last question before we go to our real scenario here. How can charities balance managing the relationship between donors and volunteers? There is a difficulty in obtaining information to perform duty without potentially offending them. Any suggestions of how a charity can do their duty, but don't offend the donor, don't offend the volunteers. Any suggestions? Maybe Elaine, I start with you first.
Bring the toolkit to the donor. Sorry. And blame it on the commissioner for charities. The commissioner requires me to do this, and I have to ask you this, so I'm sorry. Right? I mean, that's a best answer. And then if you, since you're a Singapore billionaire, surely,
E-copy.
you should ask the commissioner if you have doubts. No, I'm joking.
Yeah.
Seriously.
I think it will be approaching it sensitively is very important. And perhaps because ultimately it's about a long-term relationship with your volunteer or your donor, then it has to be a very private way of trying to understand what the background is by perhaps having a face-to-face conversation. And all that's important, right, when you're trying to develop a relationship. So perhaps the best way to avoid antagonizing someone or offending them is to send a whole long application, for example, form that needs to be filled out. Perhaps the more personal way is to get in touch, arrange a meeting, sit down, understand who that person is, get to know that person, and then obtain that information in a very personal way, right? So that that relationship can be developed over the long term.
Okay, Jason.
So it's kind of linking back to what we were talking about earlier in relation to training, right? So you think about it, yes, it can be quite intrusive to some, but generally, if people are trying to donate money for the greater good, the way they react to questions and whatnot will be different. Yes, some will prefer to not be known or named, but they are unlikely to be evasive, as opposed to someone who is really trying to launder proceeds of crime. So I think the ability to interact with the donors, the volunteers, and to pick up any cues, whether verbal or physical, from these parties, is actually quite important as well. So, unfortunately, it's always going to be, a balance between trying to upset someone and not invade someone's privacy. But I think at the end of the day, everyone is just trying to play out their roles and responsibilities. So I think if you ask honest questions and whatnot, and if you're getting honest answers back, you don't find anything amiss, at least that's a starting point as well, as opposed to, you picked up unusual behavior cues from the individuals, and that may warrant a further review into that donors.
I think there's also, I would add to what Elaine and Jason said, I think there's also a distinction, and the fact that you are a charity, and as Jason said, I mean, the values are supposed to be aligned with the donor, right? So you wouldn't expect the donor to actually push back on this. And in the billionaire scenario, yeah, the billionaire would have an army of PAs to deal with these things on a regular basis, just as they have to deal with addressing the same questions and even more enhanced diligence, in a sense, perhaps, with the banks. So they're used to it. So this sort of reluctance or the hesitation or the fear, which is entirely understandable. I think it's important to appreciate that they deal with this. The donor, the high net worth donors team, deals with these things on a daily, weekly basis vis-a-vis their financial institutions or their lawyers, and doing the same thing vis-a-vis the charity that is for a good cause. They are the ones driving it in terms of them wanting to further that cause. I don't think that it's perhaps should not be thought of as carrying the risk of pushing them away as one would think. Yeah.
Thank you. So we're going to go to our next case scenario, which is Charity B. Now, while it comes up quickly, Charity B is based in Singapore, recently received another substantial, massive $500,000 from an anonymous donor. Now, the donor has given a condition that a portion of the funds be used to support an international humanitarian efforts in a conflict zone. Eager to fulfill its mission, Charity B allocated or ring-fenced the funds without conducting thorough due diligence on the local partners receiving the aid. In recent news reports, it flagged that one of these partners had ties to a terrorist group. Now, while there is no direct evidence to substantiate the claim, the report has placed Charity B under a lot of scrutiny raising all kinds of questions about the legitimacy of its operations, the lack of checks conducted before dispersing the funds. Now, Charity B now must really navigate the potential legal, reputational, operational risk posed by the situation while addressing concerns from its other stakeholders, other donors, even the staff, ensuring compliance with AML CFT regulations. So I'm going to start with Elaine first. How can Charity B balance the pressure to fulfill the donors' conditions, given that the donor said this part must, at least 10% must go and help people here, with the need for a rigorous due diligence and governance check?
I think generally speaking, for any charity intending to accept conditional donations, they've got to be really vigilant against that risk that they're being used as a vehicle to transfer illicit funds. And I think that risk is really heightened where you have conditions attached to the donation that don't quite allow you to assess the appropriateness of the use of the funds, or to understand what the source of the funds are, or even to work with partners that you may not be comfortable with. Right. So just coming back to the case study, I think Charity B would not have found itself in that situation, right, which it finds itself now, if it had proper evaluation processes and it had proper processes to collect information relating to that donation. So in my mind, I would envisage an evaluation process that will involve an application process where the donor provides information relating to the project, the nature of the project, because you want to be able to assess from the charity's perspective that that project aligns with your charitable objectives, that that project aligns with perhaps your planned activities, your priorities, right? And if you don't have that right, then I think that's a red flag, right? It'll also be very important to be able to gather information in that process relating to who the donor is, given the huge donation, right? And also to understand who these beneficiaries are that we're supposed to be undertaking this project for, right? Well, if the beneficiaries are cited in some high-risk area, then the worry is there some sort of terrorism financing that could be linked to this donation having to be directed to them. And then, of course, having to work with that partner. If you don't know who exactly that partner is, then there's going to be some doubts about whether they're of good standing. So you definitely want information relating to who the partner is, what their credentials are. Have they done this before? Do they have the capacity and resource to see through? Right. So I think all that's going to be very important if you want to assess the legitimacy of this conditional donation, the AML CFT risk. But of course, if the board eventually decides it's actually okay, we can do this, right? Then I think on an ongoing basis, monitoring is going to be very important, because you want to have the right to go down and monitor, or you want to have the right to get information relating to what's happening, right? And that's going to be important to assess, right, that the legitimacy. Maybe one last point on measures that a charity like that can take to protect its interests. Looking at it from a lawyer's hat, a written agreement perhaps between the charity and the donor, or maybe the beneficiaries and the partner, just to set up roles and responsibilities, to set out the time frame of the project, to set out the type of information they need on an ongoing basis to monitor, right, that the project is running well and that the funds are being used in the intended manner. So I think if Charity B had all that in place, then they would be better placed to protect themselves from the situation that they now find themselves in.
Thank you, Elaine. So I'm going to go worst case scenario with Danny. Okay, so now Charity B has realized, okay, oh no, the money is really used to finance terrorist activities. What happens to them? Like, do they have to shut down? They have to stop all their services, their outreach? What can really happen?
You're always making me the bearer of bad news. I'm actually a very fun-loving person and I'm very positive.
The bad news
But
as well.
since I've been designated as the person carrying the death knell, I mean, you all know this. You know, the legal sanctions, the penal sanctions or the criminal sanctions, as they call it, regulatory sanctions, for example, loss of charity status. suspension while, you put on rectification or remedial measures that are then audited by third parties, independent parties, to make sure that you've got your house in order and your operations being suspended in the meantime. Your accounts, and I think that's all from a Singapore regulatory and legal standpoint. But more practically, depending on the type of organization that is the local partner which receive the monies, and if they're really on the scale of the top end of the terrorists as a terrorist organization, then you might actually find yourself potentially subject to sanctions by authorities even outside of Singapore, depending on where you operate. So you're not just looking at a Singapore lens. The other aspect is that even if your charity status is not suspended or revoked, you could lose your banking, your access to international banking forever. Because the banks would not want to facilitate your operations because you're high risk customer. So those are the practical measures, and you might actually clear yourself of your name and defend yourself, as Elaine said, because you actually then, through the 1 year investigation after that, while you're suspended, you actually prove your innocence, that you actually did your due diligence in part, and had all these reports. But because the banks have caught you on the radar, then you might be having no access to the international banking platforms forever. Even though you might have a charity status still. So those are really the practical implications, and it goes well beyond just the legal penalties and the regulatory penalties.
Thank you. And someone actually asked a question, which I'm going to ask: is 10% of the charities are dealing with high risk countries? So which are the high risk countries that our audience they want to be aware of? Maybe just,
I think it's politically incorrect for me to identify, and again, you're making me to be the one, Regana, to identify the high-risk countries. I would say, go to FATF, Google FATF, gray list, black list, it's all there, orange list, whatever list. And there are also lists of, I think you referred, Jason, to the UN list of sanctioned organizations. There are also lists of terrorist organizations out there. Don't rely on ChatGPT necessarily. But yeah, there are all the lists out there. Go to the list and you'll be easily able to identify that. I think it's in the context of that information out there and all the lists out there that if you don't identify it, then the questions from the authorities will be that why didn't you even do that basic due diligence?
So to also share on what Danny shared earlier as well. In terms of FATF, they would have 2 countries right now on what you call the blacklist. So that's North Korea or DPRK, and then there's Iran. And then they have other countries that are what they call on the gray list. So these are countries where they have shown deficiencies in AML/CFT regimes. So the thing to take note as well is that these countries are being updated from time to time. So it's important to make sure that you are also having a periodic review of those jurisdictions. And also, in terms of the countries that are being sanctioned by the UN, Singapore follows them as well. So there are a few countries that Singapore has specific sanctions against, and those will be available in the references as provided as part of the toolkit.
And I think it's important to bear in mind when you're looking at all these lists that the FATF list is really talking about, in our context of the discussion today, money laundering and financial regulation and how solid the frameworks are, and not necessarily about terrorist financing or terrorist organizations. So there are different lists for different purposes, right? And so just because a country is on the FATF gray list doesn't mean that you don't do anything with them or don't receive money from those jurisdictions. It's just that you have to be more thoughtful about it and ask more questions or start wondering about and have your nose and your smell test actually be alerted.
Elaine, anything else to add?
I think both my panelists have comprehensively covered it. Agree that definitely if you if there are suspicious circumstances as a result of a donor in a high-risk jurisdiction, then that's when all that due diligence checks will become necessary.
Yeah, and one point as well, the the fact that they are on a very clean list, on no list, and they're not gray or black or anything like that, also the opposite is not true. Doesn't mean that they're clean and therefore you don't need to do anything. I think, in fact, quite often, I mean, the sophisticated criminal organizations wouldn't be from certain identified countries where definitely your smell test will be alerted. It's usually those that you will not be suspicious about that is the most tricky the most tricky sources.
So I'm going to ask Jason the next question. In the event Charity B is cleared of everything, how can they improve their financial controls to better screen, monitor donations, particularly those who have said, oh, a portion of this must go here in high-risk countries? What can they do?
So I'm gonna sound like I'm marketing the PF risk mitigation toolkit. Yes, exactly. So I think the toolkit does set out, I think clearly to our earlier discussion points as well, right? You have to first of all recognize that there are certain events in this scenario that is changing the risk that the charity is carrying. So for example, first of all, the donation is quite substantial. Second, there's a condition to divert the funds to a conflict zone, right? So I'm working on the assumption that this charity has no experience in that. So when you have such a situation event happening, if you were to take guidance from the toolkit, it actually prompts you to reconsider and reassess the risk, and then forces you to think about, okay, so I know this is the risk I'm exposed to. What can I do about it? What are the mitigating controls that I can put in place? And you can find that in the toolkit, right, there are a few options, 4 options, in fact, on how you can deal with the risk. The most, simplistic one is elimination, right? We just don't accept the donation and therefore we don't bear any risk. But if you look at all the other considerations, there could be also the option of thinking about whether there's any other charity in Singapore that may be also looking to, provide support to the conflict zone. As we all know, right? I mean, Singapore, when we have something in the conflict zone, the charities do come together, work together, and try to support. Do they then have, because of their experience in working in conflict zone, reliable, dependable, trustworthy partners locally that they can work with? So yes, the donor may have stipulated certain conditions that you are to work with this local partner, but the reality is we could have done more due diligence, but the information that we could have gotten back may be limited as well. But if we're able to find someone who has experience in working in that conflict zone, they have a local partner that can be trusted, we can also try to find out whether we can count on that local partner that's stipulated by the donor in this case to see whether it is a potential high-risk event for the charity as well. So again, I default back to a toolkit, work through the steps. I think in this instance, if you look at it, the charity was kind of put in a position where it's time sensitive. There's a condition, it's a conflict zone, you need to send the money across quickly. Otherwise, I won't give you the donation. So you think about it, the added time pressure, yes, there's always a legitimate reason for urgency because it's a conflict zone. But also think about whether it's deliberately put in place because, they realize that if we put pressure on the charity, they will not have the time to do the proper due diligence, and therefore they may be more successful in pushing through the transaction to the intended recipients, let's say for terrorism finance.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, let's go back and look at the toolkit again very quickly. Anything else to add from the toolkit, Elaine, for this scenario?
You mean in terms of the template guidance? Not specifically on conditional, right, donations, but again, all the other elements in the guidance template on due diligence, on screening, on selection of beneficiaries, having criteria in there to ensure that you have a good handle of who they are. Similarly for your partners, I think the toolkit has provisions in there that help you to think about that, to formulate what you want to do. So I think all that's very relevant to conditional donations. But as I said, it's very important to have a very clear evaluation process. And you can have that by putting that into your toolkit, right? So that you have your selection criteria for beneficiaries and partners, and you make it very clear perhaps to the potential donor of a conditional donation, that these are the criteria, and this is the information that we need from you to evaluate the donation. And I think if you are very clear about that, then that, helps to alleviate that donor pressure so that the donor knows what to expect and what he needs to do.
Okay. So I'm going to bring this panel to a slight close. And thank you very much to all three panelists. Insightful discussions. I'm just going to take one or two more questions from our audience. This was quite interesting. If donations have been received from a donor who initially has been cleared by the Charities DD, everything kosher, but down the road, the donor has been flagged as a risk assessment, what can the charity do?
So I would say you would then have to reassess the relationship with the donor. Then there needs to be consideration of, because it wasn't clear whether it's a long-term relationship with the donor or is it a one-time donation. If it's something that's more long-term in nature, then I think you need to consider the donor as higher risk potentially, and you need to look at measures to ring fence the donations coming through.
Okay. Yeah. And I also agree with that. If the donor is someone that the charity has a long-term relationship with, then of course, if there's something that comes up in terms of a red flag, then you're needing to reassess the measures that you have in place in dealing with that donor. Whether there's a need for a suspicious transaction report, or whether there's a need to terminate that relationship, or like Jason says, ring fence the funds. So it's really that process of reassessment. Nothing stays static. Risk can change, profiles can change. So yeah, a charity has to be very vigilant to those changes and be able to adapt their measures to deal with it.
Danny, anything to add for this?
Later on, I suppose, in the ideal world, you would have a system that would also update, right? A database whereby immediately, hopefully technology will facilitate that. This new list of suspicious parties then gets fed into your database, and then, it gets marked as something that is orange, for example, just hypothetically. Then next time if money comes in from, or is proposed to be received from the orange flag party, then reassessment. Yeah.
Actually, I also want to make
Yes.
one point, which is that if there is a red flag in relation to the donor, then I think it's very important on an organizational wide perspective that this be made known to the relevant parties, for example, finance, right? Because what if a request for a refund comes in from the donor? How would you assess that? Do you need to escalate that to the board so the board understands the risk, and everyone else then needs to be very mindful, right, of circumstances like that, so they don't process that refund instantly, for example, right? They think about it.
Yeah, I think
and
it's true
decide whether or not.
communication.
Yes,
Okay.
that's right.
So I think on that note, 2 hours has flown by.
Has it?
Yes, it has. So before we can let you go, for all our three panelists to actually think about one key takeaway you would like our participants here today to walk away with, besides the toolkit and the guideline template, a takeaway that you want them to walk away with. So I'm going to start with Jason.
Sure, happy to be the first because we didn't rehearse this, so hopefully it doesn't overlap. So for me, I've been thinking about, when we talk about money laundering, terrorism financing, is something that is conceptually quite new to charities, right? And I've been thinking, actually, is it something so fundamentally different from what charities are setting out to achieve? Now, I share about me going to a preschool, looking at young kids, how they are in the preschool, getting the education that they should have. And at the end of the day, I realize it's all about the beneficiaries, right? So what we are trying to do is essentially to make sure that the funds that we're getting from the donors are being routed to the intended beneficiaries. And you think about, what we're trying to advocate here in money laundering, terrorism financing, risk mitigation is also about that. We want to make sure at the end of the day, the recipients of the funds are the intended beneficiaries. And therefore, and that's the reason why we are doing the due diligence and whatnot. So it actually, is aligned with the objective of what we're trying to do as a sector. So, I just wanted to leave that with the audience, because I think please don't think of this as an additional measure, steps, burden. Actually, I think it fits perfectly well with the overall goal. I think we should all work towards.
Thank you. Danny?
I think that's an excellent point. I mean, the whole reason for your existence is really to serve your goal or your purpose for which you're set up, right? And ensuring that you receive the funds and are able to channel it properly to the right people serves that purpose. So all this goes into that. I mean, from my part, I mean, coming back to my references to being an investigator, smell test, and I think ultimately beyond the theory, the toolkit, underpinning the toolkit is, I think, fundamentally just one point, just common sense, right? Just common sense inquiry, ask when in doubt, be on alert based on the training and the principles. You can't remember everything. What to do exactly is not really the point, right? That's later stage. That's phase 2. The question is, what do you smell? And do you smell it? And I think, being able to apply common sense logic to it, having an investigative mindset to ask the right questions, I think that's a great starting point. And if your entire team can be trained that way and have that mindset, is one of mindset, and that is, the battle more than half won. Yeah.
And Elaine?
I think charities play such a vital role, right, in our social system, because there's so much good that needs to be done out there for marginalized communities. Some charities, like the one that I work for, operate in environments where there are risks, right? Because you're providing aid to areas where there's conflict, or even in countries which have very low infrastructure. And that's where, the humanitarian need is the greatest. But of course, for some charities, they operate in situations where it's not like that, it's not so high risk, but still from time to time, they might get unusual donations. They might get unusual requests for refunds. So if charities want to continue doing the good that they are set out to do in line with the objectives, then very important, you've got to take steps to protect yourselves, and you've got to take steps to make sure that the work that you do goes the way that's meant to. And I think in order to do that, then I'm hopeful that the template guidance and the toolkit that Jason prepared will equip charities with the necessary tools, right? So that they can put into place their best practices. Yeah, so I'm really hopeful that that will come to pass.
Wise words from all our 3 panelists. Now, as we wrap up, let's remember that combating money laundering, terrorist financing requires all of us here, online, offline, to act. In the words of Commissioner, keeping vigilant is your first line of defense. Your collective efforts are key to safeguarding the charity sector and ensuring its integrity. Now, if you did not click on the links shared during the webinar, these links will be included in a follow-up email, which will be sent tomorrow. I'm going to sell a little bit of Koyo. Please do click on the links for the toolkit, for the guidance template. I had a read of it and it's really good and it's informative. So please do that. At the same time, you will be seeing a QR code to fill up. It's a survey form, and the link in the survey to the form is also shared in the chat function. We really appreciate your comments and feedback, and we will certainly use it to improve our webinars in the future. I want to express my deepest gratitude to all our 3 panelists here, Elaine, Danny, and Jason, for your invaluable insights, be it good news or bad news, doesn't matter, for walking us through what is next. Special thanks to COC, Desmond Chin, Ms. Yap, and Mr. Lim for their very informative sharing, and to our audience today. Okay, learning doesn't stop here, and I think we have talked about training, we talk about communication. Constantly learn. And if you have any other question that arises after this webinar, ask, always ask. And reach out to, of course, the charities unit at MCCY, and they're working very hard today.
Yeah.
So remember, money laundering weakens our charity organizations because it erodes public trust. Charities depend on public trust. It is therefore a responsibility of every charity here today, big or small. You need to be aware of AML, CFT responsibilities, how to implement it in meaningful ways with common sense that are relevant to your organization and in your area of service. Okay? AML, CFT obligations should not be treat it as a box-ticking exercise. You have to take it very seriously. You can really make a difference. So if your charity needs legal advice, please email us, assistnpos@probono.sg. Don't forget, you will receive an email containing the slides and the links shared during today's webinar tomorrow. And on behalf of Pro Bono SG, the Office of Commissioner of Charities, thank you again to all our speakers. Thank you to our audience today for asking all the right and tough questions. And have a great week ahead. Thank you.